Next, we're going to add support for editing existing expenses, and we're going to use the same view that we used to create a new expense. In this version, we're going to pass an expense to that view to be edited.
So you can see this in the simulator. When you actually select an existing expense, it'll take you to the same screen that looks like you're actually creating a new expense. Our goal is to pass that expense forward, populate this with the data, and when the user clicks save, instead of actually creating a new record, it updates the existing one.
Now we have, just to review, a prototype cell, and is there a segue already on this that leads to here, right? That's different than the plus one?
Nope, it is actually the exact same segue.
Okay.
We have a single segue from our view controller with the identifier show expense. In our expense view controller, we have an implementation of the UI table view delegate, where when they select a row, we perform the segue, and that same segue is performed when the users click add new expense.
So this is based on manual perform segues as opposed to an automated segue.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the next step, well, the very first step ultimately, is let's go to the single expense view controller. We need to create a place where we can actually store the existing expense if it exists. So right below zone, above our expenses delegate, I'm going to create a new variable. And I'm going to call this record. This is going to be of type CK record, and it's going to be optional. Ultimately in our code, if record is optional, then we're going to create a new record. If record exists, we're going to update it with our new information and save that record instead. So to do this, let's go down to our save expenses and let's create a new well, actually we even have it right here. Let record equal CK record. Dale, we're always creating a new record here, and I have a feeling we can use the nil coalescing operator here. What do you think?
Sure. So we could say, let's get it if it already exists, otherwise create it.
So what I'm doing here, and I don't need the self statement, is I am getting the existing record if it exists. Actually, I do.
You do, because let record is going to define a local record variable or constant, and self record refers to the one in the class.
Perfect. So what we're saying here is if the existing record exists, use that. Else you're going to create a new CK record. Then we are simply setting the objects for this existing record or new record for that matter. At this point, it does not matter. And we're conducting our save just like we normally would. So now we actually need to pass this existing expense forward, and we can do that via the expenses view controller. If I navigate up, or down, to our prepare for segue, we need to do it in here. We're already checking to guard let our destination equal segue destination as single expense view controller to make sure that our destination is of type single expense view controller. We need to do one more check in here. We need to check if our table view has a selected row. So we're going to do an if let selected row equals expenses table view dot index path for selected row, and notice how that's optional, and we're going to use optional chaining to get the row, and we're going to unwrap that. If we enter this if let statement, it means the user has actually selected a row and we've already started to move forward with our segue. So in here we need to access our selected record by accessing our records array. This is the array with all the records and only getting the one for the selected row. Now that we have the selected record, we need to access our destination, access our record, and save our selected record to that.
And could we just simply do that?
And we can. And that simplifies our code, makes it slightly more readable, and works perfectly. So at this point, when I build and run this application, I can now select an existing record, and we're not actually passing it forward, but we are. We're just not actually setting the UI elements to show that we've actually passed it forward. So in the single view, or the single expense view controller, we need to do a little initialization of our UI elements. So let us access the name text field dot text is equal to, and let's get our record. And remember, it is object for key. For key name. And you remember we have to cast this as a string. Now we have to do the same thing for our amount. So it's amount text field dot text equals record dot object for key amount as string. And finally, we have to do it for date as well. Date picker dot date. But pay attention to this type of date. It is not optional, so we have to handle that case. Equals record. Actually, let's change this a little bit. Since we have to handle that the record's date is not nil, let's do it in if let. If let date equals date. Actually, it's record dot object for key of date as date. Unwrap that. Now we access our date pickers. Date is equal to date. Now building and running this application. Selecting the iPhone 10. And notice what happens. Our name, iPhone 10. Amount, $1,200 at the time that it was actually created.
Before you hit save, I predict a bug in our future.
Okay.
So previously, we were only using this view controller for saving new expenses. And now we're using it to update expenses. And when it's done saving, we did the delegation to add this item to the list of records. And we're going to do that, and we're going to end up with two of them.
Yeah, we are. So let's not even save it, because that's going to throw everything off and be kind of problematic. So let's go back into our code, and let's look at our save expense. And right here, if let saved records equals saved records. Ultimately, we only want to call this code if we have changed it or that we've actually edited it. So let's go to our delegate and add another function. Func edited, let's just say edited record, right? And now that we have this function, our expenses view controller has to now implement it. So I'm going to go down to our extension where we implement our first add records and start typing edited record. And essentially all we need to do if a user has edited a record, since the record has stayed the same and it's a reference to the record and we don't have to pass that information back, we just need to update our view. So I'm going to access the expenses table view. Again, making sure this is optional, I'm going to call reload data. Dale, do you see any problem with what I've done so far?
Not so far.
So now over back in our single expense view controller, where we're getting our if let records, let's check to see if we have an existing record in this view controller. So if, and ultimately I don't even need to unwrap it, so I could say if self.record is equal, not equal to nil, else if, and here's my opportunity to call the expenses delegate and tell it we edited a record. What do you think, Dale?
Sounds good.
Sounds good. Let's try this out. Accessing iPhone 10 again, because you know, I really want an iPhone 10 that's a plus size device, so I'm going to change this phone to iPhone 10 Plus. And obviously, if we jump screen sizes, we have to double the price. And so now is my opportunity to click Save. Notice that our UI is actually updated with the new record. And let's go to CloudKit's dashboard. Access our container. Access our data, and then query for those records to verify that it occurred. And there we go, iPhone 10 Plus, amount $2,400.